She was forced to marry a cold doctor until his hidden past broke her heart in his pride. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The bells of St. Andrew's Chapel tolled 9 times, each chime echoing through the misty streets of Boston like a countdown to a life she no longer recognized. At the back of the grand marble aisle, Clara Bennett stood frozen, clutching a bouquet of white roses so tightly the stems bent beneath her trembling fingers. The flowers smelled of antiseptic and endings not joy. Her lace veil brushed her shoulders like a shroud as she stared down the crimson carpet leading to the man she was about to marry, a man whose name would save her mother's life, but would cost her her own freedom. Somewhere in the crowd someone whispered, "She's marrying him for money," and the truth burned through her like fire. Still, she lifted her chin, forced 1 foot forward, and stepped into the cage disguised as a wedding. Dr. Nathaniel Hale stood waiting at the altar, flawless in his black tuxedo, his expression carved from granite. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his posture impeccable, but his eyes, those cool gray surgeon's eyes, never softened as they met hers. The crowd hushed as the organ played, and Clara's pulse thundered louder than the music. When she reached his side, Nate leaned forward, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Let's make this quick." The words were sharp, clinical, stripped of tenderness. She nodded once, her throat too tight to speak. The ceremony unfolded like a script rehearsed too many times. Every vow was mechanical, every touch practiced. When the priest asked if they took each other in sickness and in health, Nate's reply came out clipped, almost impatient. The kiss that followed was not a union, it was a transaction, a signature sealed in public view. Cameras flashed, society smiled, and in the back row, Harold Hale, Nate's father, grinned like a man closing a profitable deal. Outside, the November air was cold enough to sting. Clara's veil fluttered in the wind as the limousine door opened. Inside, silence hung thick as fog. Nate tugged at his bow tie, loosening it with a frustrated sigh. "The reception," he said, flatly staring out the window. "We'll stay 2 hours." We shake hands, smile for the photographers, cut the cake, and leave. Clara turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "It's our wedding day, Nathaniel." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a wince. "No, Clara. It's a contract. My father's pride for your mother's survival. Let's not pretend it's anything more." Her breath caught. For a moment she thought she might cry, but pride wouldn't let her. Instead, she looked out the window at the blurred city lights, Boston's skyline gleaming like 1,000 watching eyes. "Then I hope your father got what he wanted," she said softly. "Because I didn't." Nate didn't answer. He only turned his head slightly, and for the first time she thought she saw something behind the coldness in his expression, something that looked like regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. 3 months earlier, Clara's world had collapsed with 1 phone call. Her father's investment firm had folded overnight, taking their family fortune with it. The marble townhouse on Beacon Hill, the cars, the art, even her college fund all gone. Then came her mother's collapse. The diagnosis: advanced heart failure. The doctors spoke in careful tones, balancing sympathy with reality. "Treatment will be expensive," one of them had said, sliding a printed estimate across the table. "Without it, she may not make it through the year." Clara remembered staring at the numbers until they blurred. That night, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, she met Harold Hale. The man was all charm and sympathy, a philanthropist with perfect manners and a smile polished by decades of power. "Your mother deserves the best care," he told her, resting a paternal hand on her shoulder. "And she'll have it. Consider it a gift from one old family friend to another." Clara had thanked him through tears. She didn't see the trap until it closed. 2 weeks later, he invited her to lunch at an exclusive restaurant overlooking the Charles River. He spoke gently, almost apologetically, as he laid out his proposal. His son, Nathaniel Hale, needed a wife, someone respectable, someone from an old Boston name. In return, Harold would cover every hospital bill, every expense, every debt. "It's not about love," he said. It's about survival for both our families." Clara remembered the gleam in his eyes when he said it, the calm conviction of a man who believed generosity gave him ownership. That night she sat at her mother's bedside and watched the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Each beep was a reminder of time running out. She imagined her mother's life without treatment, the weakness, the pain, the slow fading. There was no choice. So when Harold called the next morning, Clara said yes. Now, as a limousine rolled through the city, she wondered what kind of man Nathaniel Hale truly was, beneath that cold perfection. She'd met him only twice before the wedding, once at his father's dinner party, where he'd spoken to her with polite indifference, and once at the chapel rehearsal, where he'd barely looked at her at all. Yet here she was, wearing his ring, bearing his name, bound to him by law and desperation. The car stopped outside the Hale family estate, where crystal chandeliers glowed through the windows and laughter spilled into the night. Nate stepped out first, holding the door open with detached courtesy. "Smile," he murmured. "They're watching." Clara lifted her chin, slipped her hand into an arm, and stepped into the golden light. Cameras flashed. Guests applauded. From a distance they looked perfect, a doctor and his bride the picture of privilege. But inside her heart felt like glass, fragile and fractured. As the orchestra struck the first note of their waltz, Nate placed a hand lightly on her waist. His touch was cold, his movements precise. "Relax," he whispered. "It's just for show." She forced herself to smile as the room watched her dress swirling under the chandelier. In that moment, Clara understood the truth. She was no longer Clara Bennett, beloved daughter of a once proud family. She was Mrs. Nathaniel Hale, wife of a man who didn't love her daughter-in-law, to a man who had bought her future and prisoner, to a life that looked beautiful from afar and hollow up close. When the music ended, applause filled the ballroom. Clara's smile never faltered, but inside something cracked, and deep down she knew this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her reckoning. The first morning in the Hale penthouse felt like waking inside a museum. Sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off glass and steel, illuminating a world too perfect, too sterile. Clara moved silently through the space, her heels echoing on polished marble floors. Every surface gleamed untouched. The faint hum of the city below was the only sound that reminded her life still existed beyond those cold walls. Nate had left before dawn. She found his breakfast untouched, a single cup of coffee, gone cold beside a neatly folded newspaper. A note sat beside it in clean, sharp handwriting: clinic. Full schedule. Don't wait for dinner. It wasn't cruel, just transactional. The kind of message one might leave for a tenant, not a wife. Clara folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't know why she bothered keeping it. Maybe because it was the only proof he'd spoken to her at all. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unbearable rhythm. Nate was a ghost moving through his own home, gone before sunrise, returning long after midnight. When they did cross paths, their words were limited to politeness. "Good morning. The maid will come Friday. Dinner's in the fridge." His tone remained distant, professional. Clara responded in kind, too proud to beg for more. She tried to make the penthouse feel human, bought flowers, rearranged the furniture, opened the curtains to let the light in. But each attempt was quietly erased. The housekeeper replaced the lilies with white orchids, Nate's preference. The chairs were returned to their original angles, the curtains drawn again before nightfall. It was as if the space itself rejected her presence. Every evening, she visited her mother. Margaret Bennett's health had improved under Harold Hale's care. The private suite at St. Matthew's Hospital more comfortable than any home Clara could now afford. Her mother's cheeks were pink again, her voice stronger. "You look tired, darling," she said one afternoon, studying Clara's face with concern. "Married life not agreeing with you." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Mom. You just focus on getting better." Margaret reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know what you did for me," she whispered. "I know this isn't the life you wanted." Clara forced a laugh, blinking away tears. "It's not so bad," she lied. "He's kind enough." Her mother frowned. "Kind enough isn't love." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't, because love was the one thing she'd bartered away. That night when she returned home, the penthouse lights were dim. Nate sat in the living room, still in his suit. His tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked exhausted, shadows carved deep beneath his eyes. For a moment she hesitated, unsure if she should speak. Then softly she said, "Long day." He didn't look up. "They're all long. I stopped by to see my mother. She's doing better. That's good." The words were mechanical, but there was a flicker of sincerity. Encouraged, she took a small step closer. "She asked about you." He turned, then his expression unreadable. "Why, she worries. She said she hopes we're happy." Nate's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then she's more optimistic than either of us." The words stung, but Clara swallowed the hurt. "I don't expect you to care about me," she said quietly. "But you could at least stop punishing me for something your father did." That got his attention. His eyes, gray and sharp, met hers. "You think this is punishment? What else would you call it?" He set the glass down, his jaw tightening. "I didn't ask for this marriage any more than you did. My father arranged it to secure his legacy, not my happiness. So forgive me if I don't play the part of the doting husband. And I didn't ask to sell my life to save my mother's," she snapped back, her voice trembling. "But here we are, pretending for everyone else while we destroy each other, in private." Silence fell heavy and raw. Nate stared at her, something shifting in his expression, a crack in the armor. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He stood, straightening his tie. "You'll have to excuse me, I have an early surgery." She watched him walk away, his footsteps fading down the hall, until the soft click of his door ended the conversation for good. The next morning, she woke to find a box on the counter. Inside was a brand new phone and a platinum credit card. A note, brief as always, for household expenses. "Buy what you need." It should have felt like kindness, but it felt like compensation. A way to make her comfortable in her gilded cage. Clara tried to focus on her part-time work, freelance writing for a medical foundation's blog, one of the few connections she'd kept from her old life. But even her words felt hollow. She wrote about hope, recovery, healing, themes that mocked her own emptiness. One afternoon, while organizing her desk, she found an envelope she hadn't noticed before. It was addressed in Harold Hale's elegant handwriting. Inside was a check made out to her mother's hospital fund, dated the day after her wedding. The memo line read, "Paid in full." Beneath it, a note. A promise kept. Her stomach twisted. The transaction was complete. Every lie, every compromise sealed with ink. That evening, she couldn't bring herself to go home right away. She wandered along the Charles River, the city lights flickering across the water. Couples strolled hand in hand, laughter floating through the cold air. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she'd chosen love instead of obligation, where her wedding dress wasn't a surrender. When she finally returned to the penthouse, the living room was dark except for the faint glow from Nate's office. The door was half open, and she paused in the doorway. He sat at his desk, his head in his hands, a stack of patient files beside him. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, human. She wanted to say something to reach across the distance between them, but her voice refused to come. Instead, she turned away quietly, her footsteps barely a whisper on the marble floor. In that moment, she realized something painful and certain. Whatever this marriage had begun, as it wasn't just a cage for her, it was a prison for him too. And somewhere deep down, a part of her still wanted to find the key. The phone rang late in the evening, sharp and insistent against the hum of the refrigerator. Clara hesitated before answering, glancing toward Nate's phone on the kitchen island. He had left it charging before rushing to the hospital. The screen flashed with a name she didn't recognize, Isabel Crane. Her thumb hovered, then pressed accept. Logan. The voice was bright, polished, full of confidence and entitlement. "You finally picked up. I've been trying all day." Clara froze. "This isn't Dr. Hale," she said carefully. "This is his wife." There was a pause, heavy with disbelief. His wife, Isabel, repeated the word, cutting through the air like glass. "I see. Well, would Mrs. Hale tell my fiancé that Isabel called?" Clara felt her stomach drop. "Fiancé." A low, bitter laugh came through the speaker. "He didn't tell you, did he? We were engaged 6 months before your charming little arrangement, but I suppose his father had other plans." The line went dead before Clara could respond. She stood there for a long time, the phone still pressed to her ear, the silence roaring in her head. When Nate returned past midnight, exhaustion written across his face, she was waiting for him in the living room. The phone sat on the coffee table like evidence. He stopped short when he saw her. Rebecca, she began, but he interrupted. Isabel. His tone was cold, defensive. What about her? She called, Clara said evenly. She said she was your fiancée. He exhaled sharply, as if she'd just reopened an old wound. Ex-fiancée, he corrected, his jaw tightening. For how long? 2 days before the wedding. Her breath caught. 2 days, he poured himself a drink, not meeting her eyes. My father wanted this alliance. I didn't have a choice. Clara stared at him, fury and heartbreak colliding inside her chest. You had a choice, Nathaniel. You could have said no. You could have fought for her for yourself. Instead, you let him destroy both of us. He turned to face her, his voice sharp. You think I wanted this. You think I enjoy waking up every day beside someone I barely know. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. Then why did you do it? Because it was easier to obey than to live honestly. Something flickered in his expression, shame maybe, or a regret, but he masked it quickly. You wouldn't understand, he muttered. You're right, she said softly. I don't understand men who trade people's lives like currency. She walked past him toward her room there, her eyes burning. Behind her, his voice rose, brittle and angry. You're not innocent in this either, Clara. You said yes. She stopped in the hallway, her shoulders tense. I said yes because my mother was dying, she whispered. What's your excuse? The door closed behind her with a quiet finality. For the next several days, the penthouse became a battlefield of silence. Nate moved through the house like a shadow, his eyes avoiding hers. Clara buried herself in hospital visits, spending hours by her mother's bedside just to feel something real. Margaret noticed immediately. You look pale, sweetheart, she said one afternoon. Is he hurting you? No, Clara said quickly, forcing a smile. He doesn't have to. Margaret frowned. I see. That night back in the penthouse, Clara found Nate's office door slightly ajar. The light from his desk lamp spilled into the hallway, illuminating the half-empty glass of whiskey beside his laptop. He was staring at a framed photo of a woman with pale blonde hair and an easy smile. Isabel. Clara knocked softly. Working late. He didn't turn. What do you want? I just wanted to ask if you're okay. Why wouldn't I be? She hesitated, then said quietly. Because you look like a man who's losing something he can't name. He finally looked up, his eyes tired. You should stop pretending you care. Maybe I'm not pretending. The silence between them was heavy, electric. For the first time, Nate looked uncertain. You shouldn't, he said quietly. It would only hurt you. Too late, she whispered. He said nothing more. Days passed. The distance between them grew sharper, crueler. Then came the Anderson Foundation Gala, a black tie event Harold insisted they attend. Appearances matter, he'd said. Smile, dance, make them believe the story. The ballroom was all chandeliers and champagne, a glittering cage. Clara wore a silver gown that shimmered under the lights. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her smile flawless. Nate stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, the perfect couple as the cameras flashed. Darling, he murmured, I need to take a call. Hospital emergency. She nodded, the lie too familiar to question. He stepped away toward the terrace, leaving his phone on the table. Moments later, it lit up with a message. Clara glanced down before she could stop herself. Isabel, missing you tonight. Wish I could be your date instead of pretending with her. The world tilted. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the phone. His passcode was the year his mother died. The message thread opened like a wound. Weeks of texts, secret meetings, whispered plans. Lies layered over lies. She couldn't breathe. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, toxic. The laughter, the music, it all blurred into noise. Sorry about that, Nate's voice said behind her. She turned slowly, the phone in her hand. Emergency surgery, she asked, her voice calm, too calm. His eyes widened when he saw the screen. Clara, how long? Don't do this here. How long? She repeated louder this time. He looked away. Since the beginning. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned out the music. She set the phone down carefully, like evidence at a crime scene. Then I suppose congratulations are in order, she said softly. You've managed to betray 2 women at once. He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. Don't touch me. Clara, please, save it, she hissed. You've said enough lies for both of us. The guests nearby turned to look, whispers rippling through the crowd. Nate's face went pale. "We'll talk at home," he said under his breath. The ride back to the penthouse was a long, suffocating silence. Rain streaked the car windows like tears neither of them could shed. When the door closed behind them, Clara turned to face him. 3 months, she said, her voice shaking. 3 months of pretending. 3 months of being nothing more than a prop in your father's parade. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted. "You don't understand." "No," she cut him off. "I understand perfectly. You use me, just like he did." He opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. "Go to her," she whispered. "Go to Isabel. At least she still believes the man you pretend to be." For a moment something broke in his expression, grief maybe, or shame, but then he turned away. He grabbed his keys, the sound of metal sharp in the quiet. "At least she doesn't make me feel like a monster," he said bitterly. "Then maybe you should stop acting like one," she replied. The door slammed behind him, leaving only the echo of his departure and the faint, suffocating scent of lilies still clinging to her wedding bouquet wilting on the counter. The sound of sirens tore through the night, sharp and distant at first, then closer, echoing off the wet streets. Clara stood frozen by the penthouse window, her reflection pale against the city lights. The rain had started again, thin, silver sheets streaking the glass, and she imagined Nate somewhere out there, driving too fast, too angry to see the red lights ahead. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself he deserved the crash that was coming. But when the phone rang just after midnight, she was already crying. "Mrs. Hale." The voice was calm, professional. "This is Boston General Hospital. There's been an accident. Your husband's been brought in. He's alive, but his condition is critical." The world tilted. She didn't even remember the elevator ride down or the taxi that took her through the storm. The next clear memory was the fluorescent light of the emergency ward, the antiseptic sting of the air, and the sight of Nate's body on the stretcher, broken, bloodied, terrifyingly still. "Head trauma, multiple fractures," the nurse explained as they wheeled him past. "He's stable for now. The doctors are preparing for surgery." Clara's knees nearly gave out. She clutched the edge of the counter, her pulse hammering in her ears. This couldn't be real. Just hours ago, they'd been screaming at each other, and now this. When Harold Hale arrived, his face was pale, but composed. "Where is he?" he demanded, his voice a whip of control, even in crisis. "They're operating," Clara said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. He turned to her, his gray eyes sharp. "What happened? I don't know," she stammered. "We argued." He left. Harold's jaw tightened. "Of course he did," he muttered, just like his mother. Clara didn't ask what that meant. She couldn't. She sank into one of the hard plastic chairs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hours blurred together, doctors walking in and out, the hum of machines, the smell of rain seeping through her clothes. When the surgeon finally appeared, his face grave but calm, Clara rose instinctively. "He's alive," the doctor said, "but the recovery will be long. There's spinal trauma. He may not walk for some time." Her breath caught. "Will he wake up?" "Yes," the doctor said, "but when he does, he'll need more than medicine." She didn't understand until she saw him again. Nate lay in the ICU, pale against the white sheets, his body a map of bruises and bandages. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Machines kept time beside him, the rhythmic pulse of life sustained by wires. Clara sat beside him for hours, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the machines hum. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to remember every cruel thing he'd ever said. But when his hand twitched in his sleep, she found herself reaching for it. When Harold entered later, his voice was low. "You should go home and rest." "I'm staying," Clara said quietly. He looked at her with something like surprise. Even after everything, she didn't answer. In the following days, Nate drifted between sleep and silence. When he finally woke, it was to a blur of light and pain. His voice was hoarse. "Where am I, Boston General?" Clara said softly. "You've been here 4 days. He blinked, his gaze unfocused until recognition dawned. "You're still here." "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" "Because you're my husband." He closed his eyes. That's not a good reason. Maybe not, she whispered, but it's the one I have. The days stretched into weeks. The doctors spoke in measured tones about nerve damage, about physical therapy and patience. Harold visited daily, bringing specialists, signing papers, giving orders. He never once looked at Nate with anything resembling compassion. Clara noticed. So did Nate. One night after Harold left, Nate turned his head toward her, his voice thin. He's disappointed, you know. In what? In me. Always has been. I was supposed to be him, only better. You're alive, Clara said. That's better. He gave a small, broken laugh. You don't know him. But she did in a way. She knew what it was like to live under someone else's control, to trade freedom for survival. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against his wrist. Then maybe it's time you stop trying to please him. He didn't answer, but his hand turned slightly, just enough for his fingers to brush hers back. As the weeks passed, Clara became his shadow. She learned how to adjust the bed, how to help him sit up, how to mask her fear when the pain made him tremble. He hated the wheelchair, at first refused to let anyone see him in it, but Clara refused to give up. One afternoon, she rolled him out onto the hospital terrace. The winter air was sharp, the sky gray over the frozen river. He stared out in silence. Why are you doing this? He asked finally. Because someone has to, she said. He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing her for the first time. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. Maybe not, she replied. But that's never stopped me before. The faintest smile touched his lips. It wasn't much, but it was something like sunlight breaking through clouds. When Harold appeared a few days later, he brought a team of nurses in an impatient tone. You'll continue recovery at home, he said briskly. I've arranged for care. Clara spoke before Nate could. That won't be necessary. I'll take care of him. Harold's eyes narrowed. This isn't your responsibility, Mrs. Hale. It is now, she said, her voice steady. For a long moment, Harold stared at her, then turned to leave. Do as you wish, he said coldly. That night, back in the penthouse, Clara helped Nate settle into the bed that had been moved into the living room. The space felt different now, less like a museum, more like a place where people actually lived. As she adjusted the blanket around him, he caught her wrist. Why are you still here, Clara? She met his gaze, her voice quiet. Because walking away would be easier. And I'm tired of easy. His eyes softened, and for the first time she saw something that looked like gratitude. Then maybe he said slowly, we start over. Clara nodded, though her heart ached with uncertainty. Maybe, she whispered. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain pattered gently against the glass, washing the city clean. Inside, in the dim glow of the lamp, two broken people sat in silence, not as enemies, not yet as lovers, but as something fragile, tentative and new. 3 months passed, and the penthouse no longer felt like a mausoleum. The sterile shine of the marble floors softened beneath scattered books, blankets, and the faint smell of chamomile tea. Nate spent most mornings in his wheelchair, by the window, the skyline of Boston stretching out like a map of his regrets. He had begun physical therapy twice a week, pushing himself harder than the doctors recommended, determined to reclaim what he'd lost. Clara was always there, steady, quiet, patient, in a way that both comforted and unnerved him. Some mornings she'd bring breakfast to the balcony, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee for him, tea for herself. He'd insist he could do it on his own, fumbling with utensils until his hands shook too hard to continue. Without a word, she'd take over and he'd let her. Their days were built on these small rituals of defiance and surrender. Your balance is improving, she said one afternoon as she steadied him in the hallway. He grunted. Barely. Barely is better than not at all. He glanced at her, a trace of dry humor flickering through his exhaustion. You sound like my therapist. Maybe you should start listening to her then. Her smile was small, but it made something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. The first time he tried to stand without help, he collapsed halfway up. The sound of the fall echoed through the room like an explosion. Clara rushed to his side, panic in her eyes, but Nate slammed a hand against the floor, furious. I said I can do it, he barked. She froze, then knelt beside him. And I said, you don't have to do it alone. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough strength to silence him. He turned away, ashamed. You don't get it, he muttered. I used to hold a scalpel for 12 hours straight without shaking. Now I can't even stand on my own." She reached out and placed her hand gently over his. "Then learn to stand with someone beside you. It's not weakness, Nate. It's human." The next morning he let her help. The change between them was slow, almost imperceptible at first. He began talking more about his surgeries, his patients, his mother. He told her how she had died when he was 8, how he'd spent years trying to fill the void with achievement and precision. Clara listened, never judging, never interrupting. Sometimes she shared pieces of herself too, stories about her childhood, about her father's gambling, about her mother's quiet strength. "I used to think love was supposed to save people," she said, once her voice distant. "But maybe it's just supposed to remind us we're worth saving." Nate didn't respond, but the words lingered long after she left the room. On one quiet evening in late February, she found him asleep in his wheelchair, the last rays of sunset painting his face in gold. His features were softer now, the harshness replaced by something almost boyish. She covered him with a blanket, and when her fingers brushed his hair, he stirred, but didn't wake. That night, she dreamed of a time before their marriage, a life where they'd met by accident in a coffee shop, laughed about the rain, and fallen in love without contracts or consequences. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, he noticed her red eyes. Bad dreams, something like that. He didn't press. But later that day, while she was in the kitchen, he rolled his chair to the piano that had stood untouched in the corner since their wedding day. His mother had loved music, and Clara had once mentioned she used to play. His fingers, stiff and uncertain, pressed a few hesitant notes. When Clara returned, she froze in the doorway. "You play?" He shook his head. "Barely. I was hoping you would." She hesitated. "It's been years." "Then start small." She sat beside him, her hands hovering over the keys. The melody she chose was soft and haunting, something her mother used to hum before the world fell apart. Nate listened, watching her face in the half-light. When the song ended, he said quietly, "Do it again." She smiled faintly and played until the room filled with warmth that neither of them dared to name. As the days grew longer, the distance between them shrank. He began asking about her writing her favorite books, the things that made her laugh. She found herself smiling at his dry humor, at the quiet moments when his guard slipped, and she caught glimpses of the man he might have been without the walls. One night, after she'd helped him back into bed, he said softly, "You should go out more." She looked puzzled. "Go out? You're young, Clara. You shouldn't spend your life taking care of me." She met his gaze, calm and steady. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He stared at her, searching for the lie, but there wasn't one. "Why?" she thought for a long moment before answering. "Because somewhere between your anger and my mistakes, I started seeing the man beneath all that noise." He didn't know what to say. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind sarcasm or distance. "You shouldn't," he murmured. "Maybe not," she said. "But I do." The silence that followed was different this time, not empty, but charged with something fragile and new. That night, long after she'd gone to her room, Nate lay awake, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade down the hall. His body ached, his scars burned, but for the first time since the accident, the ache didn't feel like punishment. It felt like possibility. Days later, during another therapy session, he stood for a full minute without collapsing. When Clara cheered softly, he looked up at her, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Don't make it a big deal," he said, though his voice trembled with pride. "Too late," she said, smiling through tears. That night he couldn't sleep. He willed himself quietly to her door and stood there, his hand hovering over the frame. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He just stood there, listening to her soft breathing, on the other side, realizing that somewhere between pain and forgiveness, between hatred and hope, his heart had started to remember what it felt like to beat for someone other than himself. The spring sunlight slipped through the curtains, falling across Nate's crutches where they leaned against the wall. Clara stood in the kitchen, stirring coffee, listening to the slow, uneven rhythm of his steps from the hallway. Every sound was a reminder of how far he'd come and how fragile his progress still was. He appeared in the doorway wearing a loose shirt and sweatpants, one hand gripping the crutch, the other steadying himself against the wall. "You should stop watching me like I'm going to fall," he said dryly. "You nearly did yesterday," she replied. "Forgive me for not wanting to scrape you off the floor." He almost smiled. Fair point. He crossed the room carefully and sank into the chair across from her. Any plans for today? She hesitated. I have a meeting at the foundation this afternoon. They want me to help draft a piece on medical funding reform. He raised an eyebrow. You're writing again, she shrugged, trying to hide her excitement. Just part-time. That's good, he said. You were always better at words than silence. The compliment caught her off guard. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the unspoken tension softening into something gentler. That afternoon, when she returned from the meeting, Nate was sitting on the couch surrounded by papers. He looked up as she entered. I was going through old files, my father's hospital investments. Something's off. Clara frowned. Off how? He held up a document, the pages filled with medical trust numbers and shell company names. These accounts shouldn't exist. Some of them are connected to the Bennett Foundation. Her stomach tightened. My family's charity, yes, he said. I think my father's been using it to move money millions, maybe under the guise of donations. He probably set up your mother's medical fund the same way. It wasn't generosity, it was a transfer. Clara's pulse quickened. Why would he do that? Control, Nate said flatly. He's always needed to own everything. He touches people, businesses, names. She sat beside him, scanning the papers, her heart sinking with every line. If this is true, my mother's treatment wasn't a gift. It was leverage. He nodded. And your marriage to me was part of the deal. Silence fell heavy between them. Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. He didn't just buy my future. He bought my mother's life. Nate leaned forward, his voice low. Then we take it back. Over the next week, they worked together in secret. Clara gathered her old correspondence with Harold. Nate cross-referenced the hospital's accounting records. The deeper they dug, the uglier the truth became. Harold had funneled patient donations, redirected medical research grants, even manipulated trust accounts linked to the Bennett name. Late one night, surrounded by files and coffee cups, Nate rubbed his temples. If this goes public, his entire empire will collapse. Good, Clara said bitterly. Let it. He looked at her, a strange mix of pride and worry in his eyes. You're not afraid. I've been afraid for too long, she said. I'm done living in his shadow. The next morning, Harold appeared unannounced. He stepped into the penthouse like he owned it, which technically he did. His gaze swept the room and settled on the open folders spread across the table. So, he said calmly, you finally found it. Clara rose to her feet, anger trembling in her voice. You used my family's name to launder your money. Harold's lips curled into a faint smile. Such an ugly word for something so, necessary. You call destroying lives necessary, she snapped. He turned to Nate, his tone turning cold. I told you once, emotion makes men weak. I suppose now I see how deep your weakness runs. Nate stood slowly, bracing himself against the crutch. You built this empire on deceit, father. It's over. Harold's voice sharpened. You wouldn't dare expose me. Everything you have comes from me. Not anymore, Nate said. Everything I am comes from surviving you. Clara stepped closer. And I'll make sure the world knows what kind of man you really are. For a brief moment, something flickered in Harold's expression. Not fear, but something darker, almost pity. You think you're saving him, he said to Clara. But he's just like me. You'll see. He turned and walked out his cane, tapping rhythmically against the marble floor. That night, Nate sat by the window, the city lights reflected in his eyes. He'll come after us, he said quietly. I know. He could ruin you, Clara. Your mother, your career. She shook her head. He already tried, and I'm still here. He looked at her for a long moment, then whispered, You don't deserve any of this. She smiled faintly. Maybe not, but neither did you. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, relentless. Clara leaned against the glass, watching it trace slow paths down the window. You said once you didn't believe in second chances, she murmured. He nodded. I was wrong. She turned to him, her voice almost a whisper. Then what do you believe in now? He hesitated, then said, You. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. She wanted to believe them, wanted to reach for him, but fear held her still. Instead, she said softly, Then prove it. He nodded once, a determination flickering behind the fatigue in his eyes. I will. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew heavier, the wind rattling the windows like a warning. But inside, something had shifted. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like a vow. The morning after Harold's visit, the air inside the penthouse felt heavier, as if his presence had left a residue that sunlight couldn't wash away. Clara stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the coffee pot as it dripped. Her hands were trembling slightly, though she didn't realize it until Nate placed a hand over hers to steady her. "He'll come after us," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why we'll strike first." They had already compiled everything: documents, signatures, bank statements, proof of Harold's shell corporations, but it wasn't enough to expose him. Harold Hale had spent decades weaving a web of influence across Boston's elite. No one took him down without consequences. "Who do we trust?" Clara asked. Nate's expression hardened. "No one in his circle. But there's one person who might help someone who owes me a favor." That afternoon, he made a call to Dr. Evelyn Carter, a former colleague, and now the head of a nonprofit watchdog group that investigated corruption in healthcare. She agreed to meet at a small cafe by the harbor, away from the eyes that watched everything in their world. When Clara and Nate arrived, Evelyn stood to greet them, her sharp blue eyes scanning Nate's crutch, the fading scars on his face, the exhaustion behind his calm exterior. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, then added with a faint smile, "but alive." "That's progress." Nate smiled faintly. "You always did have a way with bedside manners." Evelyn turned serious. "You said it's about Harold Hale." Nate slid the folder across the table. "Everything you need to prove he's been laundering millions through charity accounts, manipulating hospital funding, and falsifying research grants." Evelyn flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with each one. "If this is real, he's gonna fall hard, but he'll take half the city's medical board with him." Clara leaned forward. "Then let him. Every person who helped him deserves to fall too." Evelyn glanced between them, her gaze softening. "You know what this means, right? The press will come for you both. They'll dig into your marriage, your family, everything." "We're ready," Clara said before Nate could answer. When they left the cafe, the wind was sharp and cold, whipping her hair into her face. Nate walked beside her in silence, his jaw tight with thought. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't have to be part of this." She stopped on the sidewalk. "Don't you dare shut me out now, Nathaniel. We started this together." He met her eyes, searching for something, fear, hesitation, but found only resolve. "You're stronger than I thought." She smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." 2 days later, Evelyn called. "The story's ready," she said. "Once I release it, there's no going back. He'll know it came from you." "Do it," Nate said. The article went live that night. Within hours, it was everywhere. Renowned surgeon Harold Hale accused of fraud and corruption in medical funding scandal. News anchors dissected every detail. Social media lit up with outrage and disbelief. Clara watched from the living room as the headlines scrolled across the screen. Nate muted the TV. "He'll come here. He wouldn't dare," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. But he did. The doorbell rang just after midnight. Nate was the one who answered. Harold stood in the doorway, rain slicking his coat, his expression unreadable. "You think you've won," he said softly. "You've humiliated me, boy. You've destroyed everything I built." "You destroyed it yourself," Nate replied. "I just stopped pretending not to see it." Harold's eyes shifted to Clara. "You did this. You turned him against me." Clara stepped forward. "You turned him against himself long before I came along." Harold's composure cracked. His voice rose, trembling with fury. "You ungrateful child. Do you think love saved you? That woman chained you to mediocrity." "Enough," Nate snapped, his voice sharp as steel. "You don't get to talk about love. You don't even know what it means." For a moment, silence filled the room. Rain drummed against the window, steady and cold. Harold's face seemed to age before their eyes. "You'll regret this," he said finally, "both of you." Then he left, his footsteps fading down the hallway until the elevator doors closed. Clara turned to Nate. "He's not done," she said. "No," he replied quietly. "But neither are we." Over the next week, the fallout spread like wildfire. The hospital board suspended Harold. His assets were frozen, and federal investigators launched an official probe. The Hale name, once untouchable, was now synonymous with scandal. But victory came at a cost. Paparazzi camped outside their building. Reporters shouted questions whenever Clara stepped out. Did you marry him for money? Were you part of the cover-up? Is it true the Hales are divorcing? She stopped answering. The door stopped going out altogether. Nate saw the exhaustion settling into her eyes. One evening he found her sitting on the couch staring blankly at the television. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You didn't deserve to be dragged into my war." She turned to him, her expression tender. "Don't you see? This isn't your war anymore. It's ours." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then I'm grateful I didn't have to fight it alone." For the first time in months, he laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that filled the empty space between them. Later that night, she stood on the balcony, the wind cool against her skin. Nate joined her, moving carefully on his crutch. The city glittered below, restless and alive. "Do you think this is the end?" she asked. He looked out over the skyline. "No," he said. "It's just the beginning of something real." When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The air between them felt lighter, cleaner, like the storm had passed, but left something new behind. Below them, the city lights shimmered like reflections on water, and for the first time, Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, they had finally stepped out of the shadows of the past. The knock on the door came early Sunday morning, soft but deliberate. Clara looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been sorting through hospital bills and half-finished grant forms. Nate had been reading on the couch, his legs stretched out when he froze at the sound. He didn't need to ask who it was. When Clara opened the door, Dr. Harold Hale stood there looking smaller than she remembered, his sharp posture bent by time and defeat. His once silver hair was dull. His tailored coat hung loose on his frame, and his eyes, cold gray like Nate's, were clouded with something she'd never seen in him before. Humility. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated for a long second, then stepped aside. Nate didn't move. He watched his father enter the living room, as though the air itself had shifted. "I won't stay long," Harold said, removing his gloves with shaking hands. "I just needed to see you both before it's too late." Nate's voice was guarded. Too late for what? For the truth. He sat down slowly, his gaze sweeping over the room. The photographs on the wall, Clara and Nate smiling faintly at a fundraiser. The view of the harbor from their balcony seemed to catch his attention. "You've made this place a home," he said softly. "I never managed that." Clara offered him tea, though her hands trembled as she poured it. The old man nodded gratefully, but didn't drink. He looked at Nate for a long time before speaking again. "I came to say I was wrong," Harold began, his voice low. "About everything. About you. About her. About what matters." Nate's expression didn't change. "You'll have to be more specific. You've been wrong about a lot." Harold sighed. "Fair enough. I thought control was love. I thought power kept people safe. But all it ever did was make me alone." Clara sat quietly, watching him struggle to find the words. "When your mother got sick," Harold continued, his tone breaking, "I couldn't save her. I had every connection, every dollar, but I couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. I swore I'd never be helpless again. That's when I started building the empire, the hospitals, the trust funds, the reputation. But it wasn't about healing anymore. It was about control, about punishing the world for taking her away." He turned toward Clara. "When I met you, you reminded me of her kind eyes, fierce will. I thought if I could bind you to this family, I could fix what I broke. But all I did was ruin two people who might have saved each other without my interference." Clara swallowed hard. "You used my family's pain to build your legacy." "I did," Harold said quietly, "and I've regretted it every day since." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with years of resentment and love that had never been spoken. Nate finally broke it. "Why come now?" Harold's eyes met his son's. "Because I don't have much time left." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean stage 4 pancreatic cancer?" Harold said simply. "The doctors found it months ago. I refused treatment." Nate's face went pale. "You what?" Harold gave a small, weary smile. "Don't look so surprised. I have spent my life prolonging the inevitable for others. I suppose it's time I accepted my own ending." Nate stood, abruptly gripping the back of the chair for balance. "You could have told me. And what would you have done?" Harold asked gently. "Pity me. Forgive me, I didn't come for that. I came to tell you I'm proud of you." Nate blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. You broke the cycle. Harold said, his voice trembling. You became the man I wanted to be, strong without cruelty, brilliant without arrogance. And you found someone who makes you human. I never could. Clara's throat tightened. You still can, she whispered. He looked at her eyes, glistening. No, my dear, it's too late for that, but it's not too late for both of you. For a long time, no one spoke. The ticking of the clock was the only sound. Then slowly, Nate crossed the room and sat across from his father. You hurt a lot of people, he said softly. I know. You hurt me, I know, and I hated you for it. Harold nodded. As you should. But I think I understand now. Harold's breath hitched. Do you? Nate's eyes softened. You weren't protecting anyone. You were afraid, and I've spent my life doing the same thing. A tear slipped down Harold's cheek. Then you're already a better man than I'll ever be. For the first time in years, Nate reached across the table and placed his hand over his father's. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was something close, a fragile bridge built too late but still standing. Clara watched the two men, her heart aching and healing all at once. When Harold rose to leave, he took an envelope from his coat and set it on the table. For the baby, he said. Clara froze. How did you? He smiled faintly. A father knows these things. Inside the envelope was a trust fund document transferring his remaining shares in the Hale Foundation to an account under Clara's name to be held for their child. Nate shook his head. We can't take this. Harold looked at him. It's not money, son. It's peace. Let me give you at least that. He turned to Clara one last time. Take care of him. He's stubborn, but his heart's worth saving. Then without another word, he walked out into the rain. They watched from the window as his figure disappeared down the street, the umbrella trembling slightly in his frail hands. Clara leaned against Nate's shoulder. Do you think he meant it? Yes, Nate said quietly. For once in his life he did. Outside, the rain softened the clouds, breaking just enough for light to slip through. It wasn't bright, not yet, but it was enough to see the city begin to shine again. The soft hum of the hospital monitors filled the room, their rhythmic beeps echoing in the still air. Clara sat by the window, one hand resting gently over her swollen belly, the other holding a folded piece of paper Harold's will now signed and notarized. He had passed quietly in his sleep 2 nights ago, his final moments spent in peace. The same man who had once ruled his world with fear had left it with a whisper and a faint smile. Nate entered quietly, his steps slow but steady without the crutch. He had walked here on his own for the first time, determined that his father's last memory of him wouldn't be of weakness. He stopped by the chair, his eyes soft when they fell on Clara. You should rest, he said gently. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes, but a small smile on her lips. I'm okay. I just keep thinking about how much everything has changed. He knelt beside her, taking her hand. It's strange, isn't it? We started this marriage because of him, and somehow he ended up giving us the family we never knew we needed. She brushed her thumb over his knuckles. Do you think he found peace, I think, Nate said. After a long pause, he finally understood what love actually means. And maybe that's enough. The next few weeks passed in quiet transformation. The Hale Foundation, once a symbol of corruption, was restructured under Clara's leadership into a non-profit supporting free clinics and medical research scholarships. Nate returned to the hospital, but this time he worked fewer hours, dedicating more of his life to teaching young residents, a promise he'd made to himself after the crash. Their home felt different now. The cold marble floors were covered with soft rugs, the minimalist walls decorated with framed photos of sunrises, family dinners, and laughter. For the first time in years, it felt like a place meant for living. On a crisp autumn morning, Clara went into labor. Nate rushed her to the same hospital where his career had begun, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and wonder. The delivery room was filled with quiet chaos, doctors, moving efficiently, machines beeping, the sharp scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. Breathe, Nate whispered, clutching her hand as another contraction rippled through her body. She let out a strained laugh. Easy for you to say. Then after what felt like a lifetime, the sound came, a sharp, beautiful cry that filled the room. The doctor smiled. It's a boy. Clara's chest shook with laughter and tears all at once as the nurse placed the tiny bundle on her chest. Nate leaned over his hand, trembling as he touched the baby's small, perfect fingers. "Hey there," he whispered. "Welcome home, little one." Clara looked at him, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. "He has your eyes. And your stubbornness," Nate said, grinning. They named him Eli Harold Hale, a tribute to both the life that had broken them and the one that had brought them back together. Weeks turned into months, and their days were filled with late-night feedings, lullabies, and quiet moments of awe. Sometimes Clara would catch Nate standing by the crib long after Eli had fallen asleep, his expression unreadable. One evening, as the first snow began to fall outside, Clara found him there again. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the glow of the nightlight. "That I almost missed this," he said quietly. "All of it. If you hadn't stayed, if you hadn't believed there was still something worth saving." She crossed the room and slipped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "You saved yourself, Nate. I just reminded you what life looks like when you let someone in." He turned, pulling her close, and kissed her forehead. "You and Eli, you're my redemption." Outside, the Sunnies slept under a blanket of snow, the lights of Boston glowing soft and golden against the white. The world felt slower now, gentler. The echoes of their past still lingered, but they no longer hurt. They were reminders of what had been lost and what had been found. Later that night, as Clara fed Eli by the window, Nate sat beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers. The baby's tiny fingers curled around one of Nate's, holding on with surprising strength. "Do you think he'll know?" Nate asked quietly. "Know how much he was wanted, how much he changed everything." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "He'll know, because we'll tell him every single day." They watched the snow fall in silence, the gentle rhythm of it matching the slow breathing of their son. In that moment, the years of pain, pride, and sacrifice finally settled into something simple: peace. And when dawn broke, painting the horizon in soft pink and gold, Clara whispered, "We made it, Nate." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "No," he said with a smile. "We're just getting started." As the camera would fade on this final scene, the snow outside the baby, asleep in his mother's arms, the faint trace of morning light wrapping them in gold, Nate's voice would linger low and full of warmth. "Sometimes love isn't what saves you. It's what teaches you how to start over." If this story touched your heart, if you believe that forgiveness and second chances can turn even the coldest beginnings into something beautiful, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling tales of love, redemption, and the strength it takes to heal.